A bad attitude can get you far in the fight game, but if you decide to play games with your opponent, you'd better be prepared to back it up. Because if you can't, you'll end up like these guys. To kick things off, we go first to a clash between Spielka and Rozanski, a rivalry that seemed on the verge of bubbling over during their final face-off. Spielka really seemed to be trying to make an impression on his opponent, doing everything to try to provoke him into a reaction. And on fight night, it seemed as though his tactics were working perfectly. An early knockdown made it seem like victory was in the cards for Spielka, but his aggression and taunting only made his opponent more determined to fight back. And before long, Rozanski had turned the tide, dropping and eventually finishing Spielka with extra style points. Sure, things never got too heated between these two, but if you poke at a professional fighter enough, you might just end up summoning the animal inside him. And no matter what the context was, this was a great comeback win. Next up, we have the collision of Jeff Horn and Anthony Mundine, another valuable lesson on why you shouldn't play with fire. Out of all the predictions that came in for Horn versus Mundine, the idea of a quick knockout was pretty low on the list. But after Mundine started to really get aggressive pre-fight, pushing Horn at the face-off, this was only gonna go one way. Horn came out with a point to prove, and after finding his range in the first 60 seconds, he stopped Mundine with a massive punch before the first round hit the halfway mark. Seriously, this was a huge shot, and despite Mundine's best attempts to get up, he crumbled to the canvas in defeat. This one is a classic example of how a big mouth can get you into some serious trouble. The gym beatdown came to pass because of this idiot's constant taunting, but even with this being the case, he suffered several brutal knockdowns and enough TKOs to fill a career. Did the punishment fit the crime? Well, he certainly didn't help his case when he decided to taunt his opponent even worse, mocking him by asking if he'd only started boxing a couple weeks ago. There's a time and place for trash talk, and man, this was not it. When Yildirim fought Chris Eubank Jr., it was a pretty entertaining press conference. Yildirim promised the British fighter that he would not be able to stand up to his skills, and the heavily Turkish crowd in the German arena would make sure he felt the pressure when the bell sounded. Well, as it turned out, Eubank was more than prepared for this, and when the fighting kicked off, he was the one to apply the pressure immediately, pushing a pace on Yildirim and dropping him with a swift uppercut early. In the third round, Eubank was fully comfortable, and he began to unload a combo that would eventually win him the fight, a scintillating flurry of punches that eventually flattened Yildirim right then and there. Total dominance. Some ill-advised 10th round showmanship comes in next, as this fighter decided he was so far ahead in this fight that showboating was a perfectly good idea. And for the most part, it did look pretty cool. His opponent was already down on the scorecard, and all things considered, if he hadn't found the perfect punch in the first 9 rounds, what were the odds of it happening now? Well, this is why combat sports are unlike anything else. You can't overturn a 50-point deficit in the final minute of the fourth quarter, but you can certainly KO a play-acting fighter stiff to steal away his victory. The perfect viral moment. Pre-fight trash talk is all well and good to sell a few tickets, but when you're making gun gestures at your opponent, don't be surprised if your target doesn't take it well. And after landing a cheap shot to the body on his adversary in place of a glove touch, there was a chance things could go either very well or very poorly from here. Unfortunately, it was once again the calm, composed fighter who managed to pull it all together when it mattered most. And after dropping his opponent with a hard shot, he opened up in a big way, dissecting him limb from limb before finishing him off in brutal fashion. Trash talk is fine, but it can't replace actual boxing talent. The boxing ring is a place for fighting, not dancing. And sure, every now and again, you'll see an athlete who manages to pull off a piece of showboating that ends up working. But in this case, trying to make a fighter as good as Adonis Stevenson look bad in a bout you're not even winning? Yeah, this was no time for an end-of-round boogie. And sure enough, Once Adonis had found his moment, he hammered his opponent with the perfect KO blow, and it put his target out cold. Ricardo Mayorga is without question one of the most ruthless pre-fight mental warfare practitioners to ever do it. Not only does he openly smoke and drink during his camps, but he'll take shots at absolutely anything or anyone. Nothing is off limits. But against FELIX TRINIDAD, despite the tense buildup, Mayorga saved his best stuff for the ring. And in the opening rounds, he made a point of dropping his hands and practically letting TRINIDAD punch him just to prove that it wouldn't work. But as the bout wore on, FELIX grew in confidence. Mayorga was pretty gassed by the middle rounds, and in the 8th, he was knocked down 3 times before TRINIDAD got the TKO win. There's nothing quite like watching a totally over-the-top idiot getting handled by a stoic opponent, and for this guy, he did absolutely everything in his power to try and get under his opponent's skin, coming across as incredibly unlikable and arrogant. But maybe he'd have the fighting skills to back it all up. Well, as it turned out, he really didn't. In the opening seconds of the fight, all of his good work in the walkout was rendered useless when a huge overhand crumpled him to the ground for the rapid TKO loss. An embarrassing defeat. This one is beyond famous at this stage. As one of the most iconic examples of instant karma in combat sports history, how could we make a video like this and not include it? This guy thought he had his bout in the bag. He was dancing with the confidence of a champion, even though this was a low-level amateur bout. And sure enough, it all turned out to be totally lacking in substance. All that bravado and showmanship was rendered totally useless when a perfectly timed head kick landed on his chin and ended his night. Safe to say, this was not an elite fighter. This is a fitting follow-up. Another very cocky fighter, this time a boxer, who clearly had no respect for his opponent's power or ability to land a killing blow. For the opening exchanges, he danced around, totally unbothered by the threat coming back at him. The problem, well, he probably should have taken that threat a lot more seriously, because when you're facing legitimate KO power, it doesn't take much to end your night. And if you have your hands down, you're just inviting trouble. And that's exactly what happened. The resulting KO was a brutal one, and a statement victory for its owner. But for as much as these taunting clips have been stupid, this one right here might just be the stupidest of them all. This guy was clearly winning the fight, battering his opponent with total ease, making the difference in skill set very apparent. So why did he drop his hands and begin taunting him? Well, he clearly had a bad case of overconfidence. And while it certainly looked good when he was ahead, when his opponent figured out his timing and found his off switch, yeah, this one gets a 10 out of 10 for embarrassment. You just stack the deck against yourself when you engage in this type of stupidity. Thankfully, though, the consequences are so violent that you rarely see people attempt this kind of thing. Out of all of the fighters we've featured on this video, if there's one that you really should think twice before crossing, it is without question Mike Tyson. Not only is he regarded as one of the most fearsome knockout artists to have ever laced up gloves, but he also just so happens to have an aura about him that no other fighter we've featured here can touch. Mike Tyson beats people before the fighting even starts. But for some reason, Peter McNeely thought he was going to be the guy to bring it all crashing down. He took on Iron Mike in his comeback bout after a long stint out of the sport. Unfortunately, any thoughts of ring rust were put to bed early, and McNeely was beaten to the point of being forced out of there in the very first round. Another flamboyant taunter comes in next, another guy who decided to play games a little too close to the fire. It was all going so well, too. The stylish approach to throwing hands he was showcasing was definitely getting the fans excited, and at this point, it was working pretty effectively. But this was more about his cockiness than his skill level. And when you play games like this, karma often has a way of finding your off switch, and that's exactly what happened here. Painful consequences usually follow bad decision-making, and we're sure this one hurt. Taunting some on the regional level can still be a bad idea, but more often than not, it's a better place to feed your ego than a high-level fight. So who knows why this dude decided to try to play games with the legendary Guillermo Rigondeaux. Known as one of the finest lower-weight fighters of his era, Rigondeaux is not the type of opponent you want to try and antagonize. But for some reason, that's exactly what this guy did. And after play-acting and trying to provoke a response, he eventually got it when Rigondeaux crushed his midsection with a hammer blow for the TKO victory. It was clear that these two fighters were just not on the same level. And though he's not always known for his finishing ability, a guy like Rigondeaux can make the difference very clear to you. One mistake that some boxing fans make when they start digging a little deeper into the sport is simple. Don't sleep on Butterbean, folks. He might look a little round in his physique, but the dude could thump. And in this case, he showed us exactly why his power is not to be trifled with. Jackie Beard went in there as confident as can be, unafraid of the hulking behemoth moving toward him. He clearly saw himself as the more technical fighter, and hey, he probably was right. But when you start taking chances against a guy who literally has sledgehammers for fists, that's where things can get a little dicey. And it didn't take long for Butterbean to find his mark, and boy did he find it. That shot that landed on Beard left him totally out of it, unable to gather himself and continue. A huge KO for Butterbean's highlight reel. David Haye gets a lot of stick from the fans, but he was a good fighter and a lot of fun in his heyday. Forgive the pun. And when he took on the legendary Vladimir Klitschko, he certainly carried the heavier bulk of the promotional load. Haye promised the world that he would reign supreme in there with the heavyweight king, showing a level of confidence that had some of his supporters picking the upset. Unfortunately for him, the very calm and stoic Klitschko didn't need to talk trash to get his point across, and when the bell rang in that ring, he let his boxing come to the fore. It was a dominant showing that really put each man's levels into perspective. Haye lost on the biggest stage of his career, and Vladimir's run as champ would continue on until yet another loudmouth Brit came along and finally brought it to an end. This one was all kinds of bizarre. After threatening to kill him in the pre-fight presser, Jose Pedraza went out there against Gervonta Tank Davis and really looked as though he was having fun, landing solid combos, moving his head well, and taunting Davis by making weird woo noises every time he threw a punch. Seriously, it was a very odd thing to watch. And as Davis upped his tempo, Pedraza did a good job slipping his combos. But when you're facing a proven finisher like Tank, tricks like this are only going to work for so long. And sure enough, when Davis started to land, he landed big. When the final KO blow came, Pedraza was so staggered by it, he pretty much accepted his defeat right then and there. A spirited effort, but there are levels to this. This one is a major case of all bark, no bite. If fights were won and lost on walkouts, this guy would probably be champion of the world. His dance moves before the fight were like something out of an 80s music video. And if you're just a casual onlooker tuning in for a good scrap, these dance moves probably went a long way in earning your support. But where things begin to truly fall apart was the actual fight. Because if he could have conserved more energy by not dancing, maybe it would have been a better idea. As soon as the fight started, it became a total one-sided beatdown. In the first round, there were 3 knockdowns and an eventual TKO defeat. So yeah, maybe don't waste all your stamina on pre-fight antics. You never know, it might just be the difference between a triumphant win and something closer to what we watched unfold with this one. Monty Barrett talked a huge game coming into this one, as he promised the world and his opponent Shane Cameron that he'd come out of this one on top, and the results would be violent. Well, he was right about that. After a feeling out process to kick things off, Cameron found his home for a crushing overhand in the 4th round, a picture-perfect shot with an ideal connection right on the sweet spot of Barrett's chin. And when it landed, he slumped over totally out cold, with zero chance of following through on his word. It was as violent a one-hitter-quitter finish as you're ever likely to see, and as you might expect, Monty Barrett was not as willing to talk from there onwards. Bernard Hopkins is one of the greatest fighters of all time, but even the legends of this sport don't escape moments of true karma like this. Because for as much as Hopkins deserves all the credit in the world for his technical mastery, his career's work, and his insane longevity in the fight game, this was a moment that he will truly never live down. Facing off against Joe Smith, Hopkins did everything in his power to belittle the skills of his opponent. He very bluntly told the world that he himself was a legend, a remarkable talent, a truly special fighter, and that Smith was nothing more than a common man. And then took things to another level entirely by telling the world and Smith to his face that he would never lose to a white man. Yeah, he went there. And I guess you guys have all probably realized where this is going. And of course it was pretty brutal. Hopkins didn't just get beaten by Smith. No, that would be too simple. Smith KO'd the great Bernard Hopkins out of the ring. That's how hard he hit him. A brutal defeat, and one that pretty much ended his career for good. In the end, it was a combination of Father Time and Bernard Hopkins' mouth that got him in trouble. But Joe Smith certainly was the one who pulled the trigger. Just because you have a bunch of crazy-looking tattoos doesn't mean you're going to be a better fighter than the guy who looks like he walked in accidentally off the street. And sure enough, this fight between Ben Nguyen and Julian Wallace went extremely viral when it happened and taught a lot of newer MMA fans a very valuable lesson about fighting and life in general. Appearances can be deceiving, folks. And if we were to tell you that only one of these guys ever made it to the UFC, we would hope that you'd have enough sense to know it wasn't the guy with the ridiculous tattoos. He really did everything in his power to try to get a reaction, bullying him in the weigh-ins in the hope that his calm demeanor would slip, even for a second. Well, it didn't work out well for him. Not at all. In fact, it took Ben Nguyen just 25 seconds to totally steamroll his way to victory. And in many ways, it was a result that really resonated with mainstream audiences. This clip ended up getting more views than the highlight reels of some legends in the sport. Sure, Ben didn't exactly become a huge sensation in the top flight, but you can't take this moment away from him. If you know anything about Adrian Bronner, you'll know that he has the type of personality that many fighters would love to silence. As dedicated a trash talker as they come, Bronner did his utmost to try and make an impact on the great Marcos Maidana. And as you might expect, his attempts to fluster the experienced icon failed entirely. But he continued to try, falling deep into his bag of tricks in the hopes of coaxing out a mistake. However, when the fighting was in full swing, the mistakes didn't come. Instead, Maidana managed to really put a hurting on Bronner. And once he dropped Bronner to the canvas, for what was the first time of his career, it was the beginning of the end. Maidana turned in a dominant display and happily managed to shut one of boxing's biggest mouths in definitive fashion. And finally, if there's a perfect way to end this video, then how about with one more example of why you should never trash talk to a guy who has literal nuclear weapons in his fists. Deontay Wilder is exactly the type of man who should not be crossed unless you possess the technical skills necessary to do what Tyson Fury did to him. And outside the Gypsy King himself, it's hard to know who else could even come close. Bermane Stiverne was certainly not that guy. And after suffering a loss to the Bronze Bomber in their first fight, he seemed oddly confident in his ability to turn it all around in the rematch. During the pre-fight build-up, he was sure to talk as much trash as he could, promising Wilder that he was nothing short of a stone-cold killer in there. Unfortunately, on fight night, that killer was nowhere to be seen. Or to be more clear, there was a killer in the ring, but it certainly wasn't Stiverne. Wilder knocked his opponent to the canvas a total of 3 times just in the first round. A brutal display, even by his own lofty standards.